Peter, you're going to start first, and rather than talk about your CV, I'm kind of interested in a couple of things just by way of introduction. How does one become the chairman of the Productivity Commission? Did you have to buy your way into it? Did you sort of... Is it something you, when you were 9, you thought, one day I'm going to be the chairperson of the Productivity Commission?
I don't think there was any financial competition to get this job. I think the competition was entirely amongst a group of... and I know most of the people, I think, by now who were candidates because they came up and identified themselves to me in different places afterwards. And the common factor is that they're all change agents of a particular kind. They were all people with scar tissue from having tried to make change in always a variety of fields. None of them came from a specific field. And I guess if you go down my background, I have worked I've run 5 or 6 different government departments, and I've worked in 4 or 5 others, but I've also worked for an airline, and I was a consultant, as we say, for a period. That's after the airline went broke. This is Ansett. So after the airline went broke, I was a transport consultant for a period. So again, recommending change to primarily the rail industry at that time. But yeah, it's a collection of change agents. Those were the candidates in the field, and I guess I was sort of last man standing kind of thing.
You having a good time?
It's a cerebral organisation, and when I say that to people who know me well, they look at me and say, it's not really you, is it? Because I am the person who usually comes in with the idea and then tortures people to prove me why it's wrong and then substitute it for something better. So that's, I'm on that continuous change path, and I think it's great for me because I've got this group of very robust, very rigorous, very powerfully minded researchers whose interest is also in change, but of the thorough and detailed kind. And you'll see in one of the things I'm going to say today, but my intention is to add value primarily, but not by replicating them, but by trying to add value in the selling of how to undertake reform, not so much the what. There's a lot of advice to government on the what. I'm going to try and add value in the how.
Well, why not lead us through that right now?
Okay, beauty. So I've got some slides that I will follow through here for you, and we jump right into it. So the productivity outlook, where else would the Productivity Commission start? So we've had a recent recovery a bit in labour productivity in Australia. Capital productivity remains of concern. It's still negative. This is counterintuitive. Why else would people keep investing in capital if they weren't getting a return out of it? But the particular factor that bothers us deeply in a policy-making sense is multi-factor productivity, because multi-factor productivity, and by the by, for those of you I've already lost on slide 1, multi-factor productivity, I'm not going to stick with it, okay? But the MFP matters mostly because it's the innovation, adaptation, reorganisation, change orientation. It's the productivity that emerges after you deduct the net investment in capital and labour that results in an increase in output. This is the buzz stuff. This is the stuff that changes an economy. And there's the picture for you. That dates from 93, 94. So you can see labour productivity has risen and continues to rise. We've had rocky periods in there. You can see multi-factor productivity is in the middle, and you might say, oh, well, that's generally, it's risen a bit and it's still flat. That's not too bad. Look at that horrible capital productivity. Well, the bottom line with that on capital productivity being negative is it generally tends to result capital investment in embedded value in labour. So some of the capital productivity is actually reflected much more in the labour, and you'd know that because you run businesses. The one that bothers us, as I said, is multi-factor productivity, because look at that period from where the dotted line is. That's 03, 04. So roughly for the last 10 years, it's been negative to flat. So that innovation, adaptation, change orientation, the thing that creates buzz in the economy, we haven't had any of it. And that's quite worrying. There's the longer term version of it. That's 73, 74. And that's multi-factor productivity and labour productivity. And you'll see labour productivity continues to rise, although what I wanted to do in putting that slide up is to draw to your attention that period in the middle, which is hard to see. Go to the red line and look at the number 3.7. That's a remarkable productivity number for Australia, and that's the mid-1990s. That's a period in which we outperformed most countries in the world. And we were quite a big productivity story. Now, there are debates about the degree to which that was caused by particular circumstances. You'll remember, of course, we were coming out of recession, and you might expect a lot of productive change in that period post a recession, but that was a period also of national competition policy reform. It was quite a significant change through from the late Hawke-Keating period through to the Howard Costello period. There are a lot of positive shifts in policy making, and they're reflected in that number. And then you'll see it start falling away. 2.5, that's still a good number, labour productivity. 1.6, then for a good period, and on this graph it's still negative labour productivity in the last part there. You'll see it's minus 1.7, but as I said, recently there has been a bit of a recovery. But MFP, multi-factor productivity, the buzz stuff in the economy, that's through the entire period effectively, again from the end of the 1990s, it's flat to negative. This bothers us in a policy sense. Here are some of the sectoral representations, and the important thing about that is the pink line are the inputs. This is what businesses in these sectors are putting in. So you can see that. Look at mining rocketing up, electricity, gas and water, big investment, big inputs. Even manufacturing is a significant input in there. And your outputs are in the red line. So the sum, but the counterintuitive part of it is the red line's not showing the reaction to the pink line that it ought to. You should be, if you're putting in that degree of investment in inputs, you should be getting that red line climbing steeply. Now, we've done analysis in the Productivity Commission. Dean Parham published a paper last year. I'd recommend it to everybody. It got a lot of publicity. It's still the extant document on this story, which says things like mining, electricity, gas and water, even to some extent in manufacturing, they're likely to get some return. It's a delayed return in the case of mining, because effectively that's a pursuit of lower grades of ore but with higher prices, so it's not necessarily getting the return, but over time we expect it will get the return. Electricity, gas and water, that's a reflection of drought and standards. In other words, in the water business, basically you haven't got much water to flog anymore, but you're still investing. You're trying to seal the leaks in pipes and you're building desal plants and things like that, but you're still not flogging any more water, so it's not showing out in the output numbers. And in the case of electricity, well, you know the debate, and I'm going to talk a little bit about electricity further on. And the story in manufacturing, we think, the story in manufacturing is explained by adjustment. But it is a unique picture in the 2000s. These negatives are a bother, a worry to us, because, as I said, there have been large increases in investment but continued poor productivity returns, which might be justified by higher profits, but that's concentrated in a few sectors, and the numbers are pretty clear on that. But a lot of sectors continue to invest right up to and even into the GFC, and yet have still not seen the productivity returns, and our best explanation for that is adjustment. Effectively, people were investing or exiting, and so it was investing in order to continue in the business. Now, why productivity matters? So productivity tremendously matters because there's only been two factors. This shows you from 74, 75 to 9, 10, the primary influences in Australia on output. And the pink bar at the top is productivity through that period. And the pink bar at the bottom is population. And that's it. So labour market participation, there have been positive increases in labour market participation through that period, particularly in the employment of women. And yet that's the contribution to output that comes from a big social trend. So when Treasury does its intergenerational report and it talks about the 3 Ps, productivity, population and participation, and a lot of policy does go into improving participation, yet look at productivity. It's the primary influence, and that's that longer period, 74, 75 to 9, 10. And here it is represented not as output but as income, and that's a longer period. This is one of Martin Parkinson's graphs, but I really like this one. That's the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, the 90s and the 2000s, and those are again the influences on national income as determined on a per capita basis. So these are where we get the money from. And the blue is productivity. Throughout all that period. The red, in the last period in the 2000s, that's the terms of trade influence. So it's particularly significant, but go back and look at all the other decades, it tends to be quite a minor influence. Not nothing, not unimportant, not to dismiss the terms of trade at all, but just to say you can't rely on this long term. So as the terms of trade becomes a lesser contributor to our income in the future, we've got to go back to the productivity story if we're going to maintain income growth. And there have been people who have spoken recently. Ross Garner has done quite a substantial and powerful presentation on this, suggesting that the story is perhaps a little more negative than I'm saying here today. I guess my purpose in saying it here today is to emphasise what you all know innately, but it's going to be a powerful influence in our advice to government, and that is to say we must return to the productivity improvement story. There are good examples of regulation delayed through this period, and the one I pick is electricity. So we, the Australian economy, started a national electricity market reform process in 1993-94, 20 years ago. Retail price regulation is still entrenched. There's no real customer framework. There's a model, it's again not effectively implemented. State-based transmission planning doesn't take into account national electricity markets. It's still state-based in its planning structure. States still develop their own reliability standards, and they're focused in particular on very short-term peaks driven by, well, in particular from consumers' perspective, driven by air conditioners. And so for a very, very short-term period in any year, you've got a very large investment in reliability standards. And market rules currently mean that interconnectors, which we build to share power between states, are still not used effectively. And finally, there's still state ownership, which can alter incentives. When you hear me speak in the future, I'm hoping to do this job for 5 years. That's the contract I signed and, all that sort of thing. So you're going to hear me bang on about incentives. I'm a strong believer that if I see a piece of policy work and I can't discover how it's altered the incentives, I'm going to say, this doesn't convince me. Doesn't mean to say it's wrong, but it doesn't convince me. And I'll do a little bit more on incentives in a sec. The other thing I really like is demography. I really like demography because you can rely upon it. It's pretty much locked in from a public policy perspective. You know what's going to happen. These are observable shifts in demand. So, and you will have heard these numbers before, but the value to me is in the third element of it. Our entry-level workforce is falling off in this country. 15 to 24-year-olds are the same in number as they were in 1993. Entering workforce each year, and as a share they're less. It just means our workforce is ageing. What does it mean by our workforce ageing? It means that retraining characteristics are going to have to vary over time. This is important in a sort of slow motion effect. It says, how are we going to get people in, and more importantly, how are we going to have to adapt? I did a speech a couple of weeks ago where I took on an example of BMW in Germany, which has developed a production line solely based around the worker of 2017. So they actually staff it with 47-year-olds on average, versus every other line they consciously designed this around the workforce that they would have in the future in order that they were planning for the kinds of adaptations they'd have to have for an older workforce. And another interesting aspect of demography, obviously we all know we're going to get lots and lots of older people, and I'm going to be one of them, so work hard and look after me in my old age. But if the ratio of aged care workers to aged persons that's currently in place is maintained, then in 2050 we will have 1 million people working in aged care alone. This doesn't sound terribly sustainable to me. That's a very large number. Perhaps it will be true. But it sounds to me like it's a big incentive for demand shifts in things like in-home care. People are, I don't think, going to go into old people's homes. They're going to want much more services provided in homes. So I like demography because it can tell you some interesting things about how public policy and demand, in particular in relation to public policy, might shift. The outlook. So here's MFP again. It's very hard to sell MFP as a bad news story, okay? And I'm not going to try. Not here today and not in too many other places. It just says there's a serious need for all of us to improve the case for change. In other words, MFP is just a way of saying we know the story is bad, so we've got to do something about it. What can we do? Well, governments will have no spare money. That's my general presumption. I'm not here to advocate fiscal-related issues. Martin Parkinson does that and I stay away from it. But the bottom line, my assessment is government won't have spare money to buy change. So I did national competition policy in the 90s, amongst other things, and the incentive in there for the states to cooperate was you may well have to introduce competition into your regulated businesses, you may lose dividends, we will compensate you. And we turned them into incentive payments. In other words, to get the reform done, we'll give you the money, and we justified it by saying you might lose some dividends. Practice, we don't think they did lose that much by way of dividends, but the bottom line is there was an incentive. I doubt we'll be able to run it again myself. I doubt we'll be able to pay from one level of government to another for reform. That means a better premium on proper policy design, which is where my word incentives is going to come back in. Plus, there are other factors which suggest we'd better get on with this. The Asian growth story may slow sooner than is desirable for any of us. I'm not going to go into detail today, but I think there's quite a lot of good analysis around that. And even protectionist sentiment may rise if things continue to remain bad in Europe for a long-term period and if the US suffers more from gridlock than it currently is. And as a consequence, what should we do? Well, in my view, we need effective public policy, and effective public policy means matching the desired outcomes with incentives. So markets are what are our primary incentive tools, but market incentives are weakened by other policies from time to time, and I'm not going to specify the other policies because that might be seen as an attack on a particular approach or attitude. But the bottom line is if markets can't do their job, then the incentives are weakened and we don't get the enforced improvement in productivity which leads to the improvement in national income over time. I don't think we hear enough about incentives in policy design, and that's particularly for me the natural incentives. I mean, regulation is an incentive in its own right. It's just I call it an unnatural incentive. The natural incentives are reward for efficiency and desire to succeed, and the threat of competition, and allowing response to new technology rather than suppressing response to new technology. And the design of sustainable policies in relation to this will take time. By time, I mean it's a 6 to 12 month process. I don't mean it'll take forever, I just mean it'll take 6 to 12 months. And in order to allow time for that good design to occur, we need a commitment from governments now to a continuous program of reform. I did a speech on the 1st of May to a conference in Sydney. It's up on the PC's website. It's my primary tool for my advocacy in the next 18 months. In it, I talk about the idea of embedding in government on a bipartisan basis a commitment to continuous change, which in practice means a statement, a formal statement of change at least once in a term. Now, I try very hard not to be prescriptive in this because politicians, for good reasons, resent the idea that even bureaucrats in my somewhat privileged position might attempt to put too close or detailed a framework around how they might respond to ideas. So my idea is we need this commitment, and the purpose in that is to change expectations amongst policymakers. Effectively, if a government says in 12 to 18 months I'm going to have a major statement of the kind that rocked the economy in the 80s through the 90s, of the kind of the Hawke, Keating and Howard Costello models, then that vacuum attracts policy interest inside the bureaucracy. Ideas are formed, policies debated, there will be consultation, things will actually be delivered. What I'm trying to do by suggesting this model is to change expectations, not just your expectations, but expectations inside government, that we will continuously conduct reform. And that's it. Hopefully I haven't taken up too much of your time this morning, and I'm happy to talk further.
No apology required, Peter.
Thanks very much.
In the spirit, we can hear from all three and then we'll open it up for a conversation. But in the spirit of it being a conversation, this being work, not being at presentations, just take 2 minutes. People at your table, what are you hearing? What are questions bubbling up? Just be active right now. Just ahead of, take some time, take 2 minutes. What did you hear? What questions bubble up for you? Have a conversation at your table.